Hi, Hashtag Impact listeners. I am Regina Larco, founder of Hashtag Impact and one of your Season 5 hosts. I'm really excited about our upcoming Season 5 that will launch in winter 2020, together with my 4 brilliant co-hosts based across the globe. Hashtag Impact Season 5 will address the Sustainable Development Goals. I will bring you encouraging impact stories from Hong Kong. A former Hashtag Impact guest that really inspired me in how he tackles the Sustainable Development Goals is Matt Friedman, founder of the Mekong Club. Just thinking back to that conversation makes me light up. And that despite the incredibly hard and heartbreaking issue he and his team are addressing, fighting modern slavery. But when I spoke to Matt, and you will notice that as well when you listen in, there's just so much passion, hope, and drive, positivity that he brings to this issue. I am impressed how Matt also brings together corporate players, uniting and mobilizing the private sector for a common cause to disrupt and end modern slavery. One of the targets of Sustainable Development Goal 8 is to take immediate and effective measures to eradicate forced labor, end modern slavery and human trafficking. As we are curating our stories for Hashtag Impact Season 5, our team went back into our archives to bring you Matt's encouraging story that was first aired on Hashtag Impact in April 2017. We'd love to invite you to join us for Season 5 as well. Find more information on how you can share your story and partner with us at hashtagimpact.com/Season 5. And now enjoy one of our Hashtag Impact classics when I sit down with Matt Friedman. It is an absolute privilege to speak to CEO of the Mekong Club, Matt Friedman, who is fighting the business of slavery. He has been doing so for over 25 years. Is that right, Matt?
That's right.
Also in his former roles at the United Nations Interagency Project on Human Trafficking and the United States Agency for International Development. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
And first of all, our listeners want to know more. Tell us about Mekong Club, your vision, and why everyone should know about it.
Okay. So I have to go all the way back to my UN days. About 6 or 7 years ago, the data related to human trafficking was beginning to become better. We knew there were 21 million people in slavery at that time. We knew how many people were being helped, and we put those two numbers together. We came to realize that out of 21 million people, we were helping about 35,000 across the world. That's with all the NGOs and the United Nations and the governments combined. That means that we were helping about 0.1% of the victims of human trafficking. The moment we saw that, our heart broke. We were striving so hard, we're doing all kinds of activities, and yet we're not even hitting 1%. So a number of us went back to the data, and as you pointed out, 70% of the 21 million, or now 45.8 million, are in forced labor, and about 60% of them are associated with supply chains. So we said, okay, well, we need to be talking to the private sector. So what we started to do is to come from Bangkok, where I was, to Hong Kong to talk to the captains of industry. We'd walk into their office and we'd talk to them about human trafficking. And a lot of them initially would say, wow, I didn't know anything about that. Then they'd say, well, now that I know about it, that seems like a business risk, but who am I going to go to? I'm not going to go to the UN. I'm not going to go to the NGO world. You guys are going to name and shame us, because there was a tremendous amount of distrust that existed. As a result of that, we came to realize that the private sector didn't know who to go to. And so the Mekong Club was basically developed by a bunch of private sector people who woke up one day and said, well, why should the NGO world be doing this? Shouldn't the private sector be addressing this issue? The private sector knows bad business. They know how to stop it. And so the Mekong Club was made up of individuals from organizations like Edelman and Winston Strawn and Kodak and Western Union that basically brought private sector people together to work with other private sector people. So in the early days, we did a lot of presentations, and we tried to get people to listen to what we were saying. And at that time, it was really sensitive. Nobody wanted to talk to us. They were afraid that even if they had a conversation with us, people might ask the question, are you having that conversation with Matt Friedman because you think there's a problem somewhere? And so it took us a while to kind of desensitize people. After a while, word of mouth started resulting in people contacting us. And then we eventually got to a point where all of the major corporations were coming to us and saying, well, we want information on human trafficking. Why? Because there were some changes taking place. There was legislation in the United States and the UK that basically said if you're a big business, you have to demonstrate what you're doing to address the issue. There were lawsuits against some major corporations. There was a lot of media coverage associated with this. There were campaigners that were naming and shaming, so they recognized that they needed to do something to address it. So after a couple of years of doing these presentations, we had the private sector come to us and say, you guys have to step up your game a little bit. Okay, you need to find a way of getting us all together so we can collectively work together to identify what needs to be done to address human trafficking. So we ended up developing a working group for bankers and finance people, for manufacturers, for retailers, for hospitality. And so these groups come together 4 times a year. They sit down together. They talk about what the issue is, what needs to be done, and they themselves identify what needs to be done. So it's not an NGO going in and telling the bankers what to do. It's the bankers telling each other what they think is needed. And then in between those working group meetings, we basically develop the tools, develop the skills, risk assessment matrices, data collection, whatever is needed to help the private sector step up and get more involved in this issue. One of the philosophies of our approach is that we don't name and shame. Everything we do is in a confidential way to offer kind of a space for the private sector to really feel comfortable as they address this. And I guess the last thing I'll say is that a lot of people, when they look at Hong Kong, they just assume that anyone who's in the private sector here is greedy and they have no interest in helping the world and it's all about the money. We haven't found that to be the case. We find lots of people within these corporations who are very benevolent. They really want to make a difference. You know, they have their kids in the same school we have our kids in. They recognize that the world needs help, and a lot of them want to step up and get involved and help to make a difference. And so the Mekong Club fosters and supports that attitude to get as many people as we can involved to add a new front in the fight against human trafficking.
Right. And these industries that you mentioned, there are 4 industries I found that you specialize in.
Right.
And I loved the reason why you focus on these industries. That's what I found on your website. It says these sectors have the greatest opportunities to impact change. Mm-hmm. Why is that?
Well, let's look at the banking world. The profits generated from human slavery are estimated to be $150 billion a year. If you can find how that money is going from a criminal activity to something else and intervene, you could have a tremendous impact on helping to reduce this criminal activity. So finding ways of using the banking system to identify red flags or potential criminal behavior and then having that information be used to stop that from taking place has a potential to help reduce forced labor in a lot of different ways. I'll give another example. If you're a manufacturer and you have a supply chain, and generally what happens with a supply chain is you have 3 tiers. The top tier is where you assemble the item. The second tier is where the kind of component parts come from. And the third tier is where the raw materials are taking place. most manufacturers only audit the top tier. But if they start going deeper into their supply chains, they'll find things. If they find things, they can correct it. And so then the potential for literally hundreds or thousands of trafficking victims in forced labor could be identified and helped out of that situation. That adds a new front alongside the NGO world to basically ensure that even more people are freed out of slavery each year.
Right. And you, of course, say you have to first raise awareness about the issue. Not a lot of people are aware. And you're actually going on road tours to raise awareness for that. So I found that you were touring. Oh my gosh, I have the numbers here. I hope I got it right. You visited 27 cities. That's right. 112 presentations. There was another number. Oh, now I forgot. In one of your talks, like how many people? Like 20,000 people?
That's
was
right.
that correct? Yeah. So you really went out to go out, educate, and that was educating the public, right? In schools. How did that work, and how was the response? That was in 2016 in the US and Canada, right?
Yeah, I had this crazy idea of wanting to go across the United States. Initially, it was 100 days and 100 presentations, but that's a long time to be away from the office. Initially, my board had a certain amount of resistance to the idea of me doing this, so we negotiated 70 days. And we started in Vancouver on June 17th and ended in New York City on August 25th. 70 consecutive days, 27 cities. It actually turned out to be 114 presentations. And we just literally kind of got in the car, drove to the next presentation, got out, did it, got in the car, went to our hotel.
Sounds exhausting.
Well, honestly, when you stop and look at it, it was not something that was possible for anyone to do, and we didn't realize that. And when I say we, my wife did this with me. I told her, we're going to go to North America and have this great road trip. You're going to have a vacation. Didn't turn out to be that
That's how
way.
You sold it to her.
That's how I sold it to her. And within 2 weeks, she understood that this was going to be something much different. And I did as well. I mean, there were days when we would do 3 presentations. It would be 3:00 in the afternoon. We have to drive 8 hours to get to Chicago, to then get up and do a presentation at 8 in the morning. But it was just sheer, willpower that allowed for us to be able to kind of move forward with this schedule. But it was a super important kind of trip for me because it offered me an opportunity to learn so much. While I was conveying information to a lot of people, I was also talking to corporations, law enforcement, NGOs, library, the general public. All of these people had an opinion. And so I was able to have a much better understanding of what is happening in the United States. And interestingly, in some ways, the United States is behind Asia when it comes to this particular topic. And I think part of the reason is that for a long time, Americans said, well, this is an issue that's overseas. It doesn't have anything to do with us. They didn't take into consideration the 14-year-old girls that were entering into prostitution as being trafficking victims, or the people who came from Latin America that were picking tomatoes and oranges and so forth. As a result, it took a while for the United States to kind of develop that infrastructure. The other thing that was quite interesting is that in a city, you would have a coalition of organizations working together, but that coalition didn't necessarily spread to the rest of the state. In the United States, there wasn't much of a hierarchy or leadership, and even in the federal side of things, you didn't have this leadership. So I've worked in some of the least developed countries, like Laos, and all the way from the top level of the government to the lowest level, you'll have an infrastructure to address human trafficking. I didn't see a lot of that. There was a lack of data collection and sharing. There were a lot of organizations that were working with each other. So what we learned from this is that there were some very discrete things that if you were to put in place, you could significantly improve the impact of what's happening in the United States. And that lesson was not only useful from the perspective of North America, but it could be applied here to my own experiences here in Asia.
Mm-hmm. We were talking a little bit before we turned on the recorder. And you mentioned, of course, working in human trafficking, although you've been doing this now for 25 years, was not something that you envisioned, I guess, as a child. Yeah. So what decisions did you make in your career that kind of led you to where you are today? Was there certain moments that you remember today that were important?
Well, I mean, I have to go all the way to my childhood. When I was 5 years old, my mom used to tell the story about how her mom was coming from Germany. Her husband had already settled, my grandfather, in Los Angeles. She was traveling by herself. She basically took the boat over to Ellis Island. She got on a train. When she got to Chicago, she thought she was in Los Angeles. So here she is going around asking everyone in German, am I here? Am I here? Nobody understood what she was saying. Finally, this man came up to her and in German said, oh, yes, your husband sent me to take you to where he is. Come with me, and I will take you to where he is. He was actually what was called a white slaver. He was going to take her off to a brothel. As it turned out, there was another German couple saw that was happening, intervened, got her back on the train. She managed to get to Los Angeles, and everything turned out to be good. Had she taken that step, had she gone off to that brothel, I wouldn't be here. It would have been a much different scenario for her and everybody else involved. And I tell that story because when I was 5 years old, I was thinking, oh my gosh, there are these people who are deceptive, that lie, that tell these stories. So that was always in the back of my mind. When it came to kind of how I got involved in human trafficking, I was a public health officer in Nepal, and my job was to basically translate resources from the U.S. government into healthier people. And so I had the HIV/AIDS portfolio. And what we were seeing is that girls that were 12, 13, 14 years old were HIV positive. Now, if you know anything about Nepal, it's a very conservative culture. They shouldn't have had that disease in that population. We couldn't understand what was going on. So we went and we started to interview them. And what we heard was the same story over and over again, how they were tricked and deceived, sometimes through marriage, where a person would marry them, say they were going to take them to the capital, Kathmandu, but instead would take them to Mumbai, India. He'd put her in a room and say, honey, just stay here. I'll be back in a few minutes. He'd then go to the madam of the brothel, get the $600 for basically selling her to the brothel. He had the gold from the wedding. He hands the wedding pictures over to the woman. He then goes to Nepal to do it again. And then imagine the madam goes into the room where the girl is, the husband's not there, and she says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 10 men a day, 7 days a week. Her initial response is shock. No, my husband loves me. He wouldn't do that. No, that's what happens. When she comes to understand she's been tricked, many of them say, I'll kill myself before I do that shameful thing. The madam then takes out the wedding photo and says, is this your mom, your dad, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. To make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You bring in some professional rapists. They will rape her 30 or 40 times in a 2-day period until eventually her will is broken. She just lays back, accepts whatever happens to her. And for 2 years, she's stuck in this situation where she'll be with 10 guys a day, every day. Doesn't matter if she's sick or she has her period or anything else. That's what her life is. Until eventually she gets to a point where she gets what's called black eye, where she's so devoid of any kind of spirit or life that nobody wants her. She's already diseased by that point. She gets thrown out onto the street. If she's lucky, she gets back to Nepal. Many of them didn't. So we were hearing these stories over and over again. But the point that brought me over the line for this was I was invited by the Indian government to go into those same brothels to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me. Went to one brothel, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. You know, why would you have an 11-year-old in a brothel? Well, first of all, there's this myth that if you have sex with a child, you can't get a disease. Or if you have a disease and have sex with a child, you'll get rid of the disease. Or if you're old and tired and have sex with a youthful person, you'll get some of that youthful vitality. So here you have a girl, she has no shape, she's wearing a dress 10, 12 sizes too big. She sees me, literally runs up and wraps herself around me and says, save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying. I turned to the police officer and I said, okay, let's get her out of here. He said, we can't do that. I said, what are you talking about? You're a police officer. He said, well, where we are now, if we try to leave, they'll kill us. So to make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. Now, I tell that story because every once in a while we are tested. That was my test. I should have gotten that girl out. And when I look back, I can think of 10 things that I could have done. I could have grabbed her and run out. I could have done a whole variety of other things. I didn't. And now that girl's face is kind of seared into my memory. And I couldn't sleep for literally weeks. All I could think about was, here's this child needed my help, and I couldn't help that child. What happened to her afterwards for having admitted, or had done this thing with this guy? She was probably beaten, and who knows what happens to her. But like a lot of activists, we have that one event that is so intense and so powerful and so relevant to us that we surrender to the fact that now that we know about this, we can't turn our backs on it. And so eventually I said, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do with my life. Not because I wanted to, but I felt compelled to. Because I knew that out there's literally tens of thousands of these girls out there. Somebody has to do something. Why not have it be me?
Mm. That moment that pushed you over the line, I saw that in your videos as well, that I'm going to put in the show notes so my listeners know that they can have a look after as well. I have to share with the listeners how I met you, because one of the things that really grabbed my attention, not only your knowledge when you shared about the human trafficking when it comes to the fashion industry, that was the topic that was addressed that day, but also your call to action to the audience afterwards.
Yes.
You hear something, you understand the problem, that's maybe the first step. But how much does it take for you to go home or after you listen to this episode and you actually cross over that line?
What's really kind of interesting about when I do presentations to audiences is, let's say it's an hour presentation. Let's say that I'm really on target and I'm getting into the cases and everyone's kind of on their edge of their chair thinking about, oh my gosh, this is so terrible. I wish there was something that I could do to help. The problem is that while you're listening to this, you're riveted and you're interested and you're committed, but then 20 minutes later in your car driving away and you're thinking about feeding the cat and what are you going to have for dinner and, what am I going to wear tomorrow? And your life kind of interferes and you lose that momentum. So one of the challenges of our time that I struggle with is how to maintain that sense of a desire to address something. Now, let me talk a little bit about what we say people can do. Let's go back to the numbers, though. So the number that you talked about at the beginning, 45.8 million, and the number of people who are being helped now is about 78,000. So we're still helping only 0.2% of the victims. That's with all of these organizations working together. The only way we're going to get that up is if we have an abolitionist movement. That means we need to go into a community and get everyone to understand the issue, to have an opinion on it, to use that information to kind of put pressure to have something happen. And so much of the reason why I do all of these talks is I'm obsessed with this idea of figuring out how to tap into kind of the general public's psyche to figure out what's going to allow them to take it to the next step. So the things that we say to people that we want them to do is learn about the issue. Why? Because if you don't know about the issue, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. Once you have that information, share it with somebody else. If you've learned, you've done one thing. If you've shared, you've done two things. If you become a responsible consumer, before you go to buy something at a store, go online to see whether that shop has a policy. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, say, listen, I like your store, I like your products. I'd feel better if you had a policy. You've done number 3. If you volunteer, there's lots of organizations that can use all types of skills that people have. And the interesting thing for me with volunteers is my youngest volunteer was 9 years old. This girl saw a video. She contacted me and says, I'm a 9-year-old student and I want to help you. And I said, well, you're 9 years old. And she says, well, have you seen that show Master Chef for Kids? 9 years old is the new 16-year-old, okay? Anyways, I accepted her offer, and she turned out to be one of my best volunteers. From her computer, she did internet searches to find articles that I needed, and she was one of the best people at doing that. The point is, it doesn't matter what age you are. If you have a desire to be a part of something, then you use it. And it just irritates me so much when I hear students say, well, I'm just a student. You're not just anything. You're just a younger person. And yeah, you don't have as much experience, but you have things that I can't do. I don't know anything about social networking. I don't know how to use a lot of the computer things. You do. You can use those types of things. So volunteering is important. Raising money. Being able to raise money and give it to the right organization. If you're in Cambodia, to keep a person in a shelter costs about $3. How many times do we go off to the mall and spend $30? If you were to take that $30 and give it to the right organization, it would have a tremendous impact on a particular victim. That's another way you can help. Reporting things that you see. If there seems to be something that is unusual that you don't really know whether there's something wrong taking place, if you report it, you can identify potentially trafficking taking place. So these are a number of things that we suggest. In the past, we've made these suggestions and a lot of people don't do it. So one of the things we're toying with now, and we're working with Microsoft on this, is to develop an app that incentivizes people to do these things. So as part of this app, what will happen is you will sign up and get something free that basically says you're on a database, and then there'll be drop-down menus that say if you do this, you get 2 points, care points. If you do this, you get 5 points or 10 points. And you get people to do things, and then those points add up, and then they have this sense of quantity associated with their contribution. We know this works because we went to one school and we said to the students, do stuff without incentivizing them. Went to the other school, said do stuff and we'll give you points. And the school that had points went off the chart. The other one didn't do anything at all. So we as human beings need to have some value system addressed. So much of what I'm trying to say is that the importance of finding ways of tapping into people who maybe want to do something, don't know what to do, use human natureness to help them to feel incentivized to do these things. You can use competition, you can use points. It doesn't matter. Whatever works is going to be what's going to add value to this process.
And now when you mentioned the app, of course, you have also developed an app that a lot of like NGO and police use to you just showed me before, so that's pretty amazing. It's maybe you can explain a bit better.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so Google came to us and said, in the spirit of using the private sector to help address this issue, can we find a way of using technology to address the problem? So we went to Thailand and we spoke to some of the law enforcement people and we said, what's the biggest issue that you face when it comes to addressing this issue? And they said, well, we come in contact with people who might be victims, but we don't know where they come from, we don't understand their language, and so we can't communicate with them to find out if there's a problem. So we developed a very simple app. And the way the app works is it has on a screen a series of flags from countries. So if a law enforcement person comes in contact with a potential victim, he urges that person to press the flag from where they come from. When they do, a video in that person's language comes on that basically says, we're the authorities, we don't know if there's an issue or not, but we're going to ask you some questions. If the answer to the question is yes, press green, no, press red. Are you here against your will? Yes or no, green or red. Do you need help? Yes or no, green or red. If they press green even once, you know there's an issue. So the authority doesn't need to know what the language is. He or she just needs to watch to see if the green is pressed. If it is, they bring the people down to the station, we get more translation taking place, and we can use this as a means of identifying more victims. It demonstrates how technology can be used to solve a development issue.
How powerful it is,
yeah,
how
exactly.
impactful.
Exactly.
Do you measure your impact, actually? Do you track when you go and speak to your corporate clients? Is there a way how you evaluate how much your programs, how much your workshops, all the things you do for your members?
Yes.
How much impact? I mean, the impact is massive already just going out and speaking and educating 20,000 people like you did on the roadshow. But is there something that you personally look into, how you feel like, oh, this is my impact and this is how I measure it?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways of answering that. Let me start with the corporate side. If you go to a company and say, well, we've trained you and we've helped you to identify ways of looking at your supply chains. Have you guys found any forced labor? No company will answer that question. It's too much of a risk for them. Having said that, we offer anonymous surveys now and then for which we will go to a group of organizations we've worked with in an anonymous way. We'll ask them that question. And we are able to gauge what changes have occurred as a result. Some of them will have admitted that they have found some issues in their supply chains and they fix them and so forth. And so that's how we measure things. The difficulty with addressing human trafficking is that, once again, we're dealing with 45.8 million people, and collectively we're all helping about, let's say, 100,000 people. If you look at my piece, maybe I'm helping 300 or 400 people a year. If you were to stop and think about how little impact we're having, it would completely shut us down. And so we use the starfish parable. Do you know that?
I think I do. Yes. I love to hear it from you, though.
So a man and his son are walking down the beach, and the beach is about 10 kilometers long, and the man keeps reaching over and picking up starfish and tossing them in the water. He'll pick up one, another. And finally the son looks at the length of the beach and looks at his dad and says, "Dad, why are you helping these starfish? This beach is 10 kilometers long. There's no way you can help all of them. What difference does it make?" So the wise father looks at his son and says, "Well, to the starfish that makes it into the water, it makes all the difference in the world." So much of the kind of philosophy that allows us to address this issue one person at a time is that if we look at the big number, it'll completely shut us down. But if we look at each person that we help, kind of gains back a certain amount of humanity, and that person gets their life back, that feels good. And we've done something that has really changed a person's life forever. Mm-hmm. And so that's how we approach that situation.
In that story, do you associate more with the wise father or with the son that raises the question in the first place?
I'm probably a combination of both of them, actually. Yeah. I feel like I've gained a certain amount of wisdom. But, I've been called an expert in human trafficking for years. I really don't like the topic because there's this assumption that I know everything. The real experts in human trafficking are the people who have been trafficked and the people who do the trafficking. I just observe that and talk about it. So understanding their stories is a big part of it. The second thing is, as you get older in life, you come to realize how much you don't know. So if there's a point at which you accept yourself as an expert and you stop learning and stop reading and stop getting more knowledge, you almost get to a point where you do a disservice to the people you're trying to educate. So, it's a much better situation to just be somebody who's a constant student. And that's how I feel about human trafficking, because every week I learn something new that I didn't know 2 weeks ago.
What's your biggest challenge right now? Is it funding? Is it clients? Is it getting the word out? What makes you sleep less at night?
I think it's going back to how do we incentivize the world to get involved in this. Let me tell you a story. I would come to Hong Kong and I would meet with people who seemed to have everything. They made tremendous amounts of money. They had the power, the prestige. They had, everything that I felt was something that would give happiness in a person's life. And I found a lot of them weren't very happy. And finally, I got to a point where I started asking people, what's with you? What is it about you that gives you that sense of sadness? And a lot of them said, listen, I feel like I have everything, but there seems to be something missing. And I don't know what that is. There's a kind of an emptiness or a lack of purpose. And what I've come to realize is that, there's a balance in life. Many of us take, but if we don't give anything back, there's an imbalance that takes place, and that's where that emptiness comes from. If you can reach into a person's life and get them to start giving something back, they are the ones that benefit more than the people who are, in fact, they're volunteering for. But helping people to understand the importance of that is the big challenge. How do I convince a person who feels like, well, maybe the emptiness is that I'm not making enough money, is in fact, you need to just get out there and help people. And I know that this transition happens because I've seen countless people that we've worked with who were on this journey, didn't know how to get across that line to actually doing something, that once they did, they blossomed. An entire part of their personality that was hidden, that was not developed, that was very immature, grew into, look at me, I'm an activist. Look at me, I'm helping these people. Look at me, I'm contributing to life. And that sense of purpose gives a completely different aspect to a person's life. So to me, finding a way of really tapping into that, understanding it, and releasing that is an important part of what needs to happen. And let me just give an example of that. I mean, when it comes to the United States elections, you had huge crowds of people that would come and get involved in things. If you see a sporting event, you see a tremendous amount of passion and enthusiasm. I don't understand why we can't tap into that same feeling when it comes to these social issues. And I'm not talking about just slavery. I'm talking about the environment or the trees or the whales or the owls or whatever it is that are out there. Why can't we find a way of tapping and getting people excited about that? I don't understand why that doesn't happen. Because within human beings is a tremendous capacity to love and a tremendous capacity for compassion and empathy and involvement. But we don't know how to walk people down that path to get them into a situation where actually they take that step where they cross over the line and they do things. That line that divides a person who wants to do something and a person who's doing something is the highest line that you can put. It's as high as Mount Everest. We just need to figure out a way of tunneling through that big mountain and allowing people to get to that other side very quickly, and then we would have a much different world.
Mm-hmm. That really made me think of my talk with Sue Toomey from Hands on Hong Kong at the very, very first episode, where she also mentioned that often when she meets the volunteers, when they come out the first time out there, they are often more impacted than the people they're actually helping, because they feel so... they feel they have really contributed, and they go home with a feeling of a bigger, more meaningful day that they had just spent.
Exactly.
And often these people made me think of your platform as well, because I found that you can donate and start crowdfunding, or not crowdfunding, fundraising for Mekong Club. And what made me think of it was that Sue said a lot of the people, they want to reward their volunteers. They want to give them credit. They want to say thank you for helping our community. But there are a lot of people that are so... so quiet about it, so modest about it, and they wouldn't even want to get an award or get this recognition. And then I saw on your donation platform as well, there are these anonymous donors that contribute to your journey.
Just Giving has a website option where if you want to raise money, then you just go off to your friends or you have an event. You know, what we're seeing now is that a birthday party for a 15-year-old that used to result in packages, you know, they pool the money and they give it to a cause. And that type of thing is new and interesting. But at the same time, once again, that feeling of contributing to something other than yourself is an important part of helping people to understand what philanthropic involvement is all about. You, just as you rightly pointed out, the person doing the volunteer work, if it's consistent with what they have to offer, if they have something that helps them to actually see it as contributing and making a difference, they will walk away from that experience super charged up, super happy, super thrilled. And I guess the one other thing that I want to say about that is that probably the biggest hindrance to people getting involved is a sense of fear of the unknown, or fear in general. Now, you know, my biggest fear in life, actually I have two, but my biggest one is public speaking. And I was in development for a long time, and I came to realize that I would be so overwhelmed with fear prior to something that I had to get over it. So I just decided that I'm going to do it all the time. So anytime an opportunity happened, I would put my hand up, and my other hand would try to pull it down. And I just got to a point where I got over it.
And you wouldn't imagine not looking at your speeches.
I'm still scared when I get up and do a speech. It's just part of like the other thing. The second fear is waking up later on in life and looking at my life and realizing I lived my life all wrong. Now, I don't know how many people who started off out of college saying, well, when I grow up, I want to be a human rights lawyer, or I want to be in an NGO and I want to do something. They didn't find the job right away. They ended up taking an insurance company job. Boom, they blinked, they opened their eyes. It's 20 years later. All of those hopes and dreams were lost, and, they reflect back. I wish I had done this. I wish I had done this. We all have to take stock of where we are in life every single day. Am I happy with what I'm doing? Is it consistent with what I want? Should I be looking for something else? That's a really important part of our life. But a lot of people kind of forget that, and then years go by, and then they wake up, and then they realize that, wow, I have regrets. And there's no reason for that, because so many of the people perhaps who are kind of listening to this podcast are young themselves, and they have these hopes and dreams. You stick with them. And even if you don't initially find that super job that you want, just stick with that plan. Try to continue down that path and strive to get what you really, really want. Because at the end of the day, we don't know what, this is our life. We want to get as much out of it as we can.
Mm-hmm. Is there something you wish you would have known before starting out with the Mekong Club?
I was hopelessly unprepared to work with the private sector. When you work in the NGO world, when you work in the UN world, we do things based on excessive amounts of details. And so just to give an example of the types of mistakes that I would make, I was invited to have this really high-power discussion with a bunch of important people that were going to be able to determine the direction of what we were doing. So I dutifully came in with my 78 slides, and I sat down. And after my fourth slide, somebody raised the hand and said, "Are you almost done?" I didn't understand that the world that I was entering into was much different from the world that I came from. And I made so many mistakes along the way simply because it wasn't instinctive for me to know how to react to these situations. If you grow up in an NGO world or UN world, you have a certain mentality and understanding. If you're in the private sector, it's much different. But the advantage of having stuck it out is now I understand both the NGO world and the private sector world. I've been able to adapt to the point at which I think that people forget that I'm an NGO guy, and I'm treated like a private sector type person. And so being able to talk both sides and to relate to both sides allows for me to be a bridge between the NGO world that sometimes can be quite hostile and the private sector that feels like they're often on the receiving end of that hostility.
Mm-hmm. 20 years from now, how has Mekong Club changed the world?
We have the private sector being given a space where they recognize that they have much to offer, and they are the ones that are the champions moving forward, urging the NGO community forward. When you stop and look at the resources of the private sector, last year the Fortune 500 companies, the largest companies in the world, brought in $31 trillion US. When you look at the combined amount of money to run all the governments in the world, it's about 21 trillion. So you're talking about 500 companies are like countries. The resources they have, the talent they have within there, the influence, the prestige, the power. If we could take even 0.1% of that and translate that into goodwill, you'd be able to do environmental things, counter trafficking, forced labor, trees, oceans, pollution, everything else, because there's so much power there. But what we've done is we've so frightened the private sector and pushed them into a corner that many of them don't want to engage on any of these sensitive topics. This is not to say that all private sector companies are good. There are organizations out there that do bad things, and obviously if they are found, they should be punished. But to basically go after major corporations that are trying to address things, to name and shame them into trying to get them to do even more, actually it does a disservice to the private sector companies that would step up and get involved if there wasn't that type of environment that took place.
Right. I'm totally speechless, actually. I'm so happy that you took on so much of the talking today. Usually I'm more chatty at the show, but today with my voice I couldn't interrupt you as much as I actually wanted to, but I would want to ask you one last question.
Okay.
You asked at this panel where I saw you talk.
Yes.
In action. You demanded people to do something.
Yes.
What would you like our listeners to do right now?
Get over yourself. Get over your fear. If you have even an inkling of a little dream of something that you want to do, then just go after it. You know, to me, I look at the world from the perspective of whether or not we achieve a certain amount of potential. As human beings, we probably only receive about or achieve 20 or 30% of our potential. And it's because we don't challenge ourselves. We don't put ourselves in difficult, awkward situations. We don't challenge our fears. And so we stay within this very safe space. And I think as human beings, inside of us, our spirit wants so much more. And so that's part of that struggle that exists within all of us, is to just do what Nike said, just do it, and just get into something and just keep moving forward. And if you feel uncomfortable, you know you're in the right direction, go a little bit further, a little bit further, a little bit further. And that really is what's going to determine the boundaries of your life. And so, I mean, that's the advice that I encourage people to do all the time. And I often find myself when I have staff that I'm working with to say, I need you to do this. And they say, well, I don't know how to do that. And okay, well, this is a good opportunity. And they say, well, what happens if I fail? Well, good. Fail. I don't care. Just do it. If you fail, that's fine. If you do it and you succeed, that's fine. It's both a success for you because you're getting to know who you are and what you need to do. I'll just say this, the world needs help, you know, not only in forced labor, but in the environment and, you know, with social issues of violence and disparity and poverty and pollution, all these things. You know, to think that 10,000 people like me who are in counter-trafficking are to get above 0.2%, it's an impossibility. We need everyone to accept the fact that modern slavery belongs to all of us. It belongs to all of our shaman. If I have time, I'll just mention one more story. It's the Where Were You story, and that is years ago when I was in Nepal, I desperately wanted to do something to address the issue of human trafficking. So I decided I was going to write a book. So as part of this book project, I would go from shelter to shelter and I would interview the women and the girls to find out what their story was. I went to one shelter and there was a girl named Gita. And every time I approached her, she would say, no, I don't want to give you an interview. But she listened to all the other interviews that were taking place. So as I was leaving that shelter, Gita finally came up and said, okay, you can have my story. So I said, great. So Gita sat on one side of the table. There were 2 or 3 of us on the other side of the table. And over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I'd ever heard of rape and torture and betrayal and everything I had heard times 10. I honestly didn't know what to say. I was speechless. Finally turned to Gita and said, wow, Gita, you must be so angry at those traffickers for what they did to you. She paused and then pointed at us and said, no, I'm angry at you. Where were you? She said that she basically every single day woke up praying for somebody to help her. Nobody came. She said that she knew that everything around her was illegal and wrong, but nobody was doing anything about it. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. They're just bad people being bad people. She said she was angry at the good people at society for not caring enough. She kept saying, Matt, why are you here? Why aren't you down there helping those girls? She said that every single day, 45.8 million slaves wake up saying, where is everybody? And I tell that story because she pretty much called us all out. She was basically saying that the world has a responsibility to address slavery because slavery is bad enough that the world needs to address slavery. Okay, we have to accept some responsibility. And what we're asking people to do is not to give up their job and go to Cambodia and work in a shelter. We're asking to learn about this, to teach others, to be more responsible, maybe do a little bit of volunteering, basically do a little fundraising. If you and everyone else did one thing or two things a year, 10 million small compassionate gestures would translate into a lot. 10 million small compassionate gestures would translate into a lot. So we need to find a way of tapping into the world, finding that piece of a person, waking it up, getting them to get over their fear, to get involved in these things, and then we would have a much better world.
Yeah. totally agree. Beautiful. I invite all the listeners to do just that, what you just said. And I would also, of course, invite everyone to have a look at what you do.
Okay.
We have all the links of your website, social media. I will put all this in the show notes. Anywhere you would want people to have a look into one of your books, into one of your... Didn't you produce some documentaries as well? Was that right? Or were you involved in some productions?
I was involved in a couple of movies, yes. I think the TEDx talk, and there is a book entitled Where Were You? It's online in Amazon. It talks a lot about my journey. The one thing that I put into that book that I thought was important was a lot of my failures. You know, our biggest kind of lessons in life is when we really mess up, you know, because then we can reflect upon it and figure out what we can do to prevent that from happening. And so, you know, the other thing that I recommend people do is to get a mentor in their life. You know, I was always fortunate through much of my career to attach myself to people who had been much further along in their career and to understand that I could learn so much from them. Reaching out to people, asking for advice, accepting their advice gives you kind of an edge to be able to move quicker through life. You don't have to make all the mistakes that other people made. And so when I counsel students who are trying to get into the field or whatever, I often say, okay, well, these are some things that I did and I wish I hadn't done it. And you can avoid that by doing this, this, and this. And so really finding those people and in respecting them. And the reason why I do it now is that when I had my mentors, they always said to me, well, I'm doing this because there's something about you that we want to invest in. But when you get to where I am in your career, you need to pass on that legacy. You have to be a part of that process. And so, you know, I'm very much involved in helping people to kind of work through and understand what they need to do in order to move forward with the hope and expectation that when they get to where I am, they will do the same thing. That passing along of knowledge and experience was very much a part of the way most of the world worked for many, many thousands of years. We seem to have lost that, but it's an important part of helping us to grow emotionally, spiritually, in what it is that we can potentially be in reaching that full potential within ourselves.
And with these personal connections to connecting to a mentor.
Yes.
And have an actual conversation face to face. What we just did.
Yeah, no, I think it's really super important because, you know, at the end of the day, developing a connection, a intellectual, a kind of experience-related connection with a person where you respect them and then want to kind of emulate or follow in their path gives you a sense of what you are striving for. So many of my mentors, I would see them as heroes within the world that they were working in. And I would look and say, well, that's what I want to be. That's where I want to go. Perhaps I haven't gotten anywhere close to where they are, but certainly I have a target in mind. And having that sense of target and purpose gives you a kind of a goal to follow through with. Otherwise, you're just kind of there not knowing what you're aspiring to be and what you're aspiring to find.
Right. Thank you so much, Matt. This was such a pleasure. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure many of you were astonished, maybe even shocked or surprised when you learned about the sheer amount of modern slaves, the biggest number even measured in all of our history, and how few of these victims actually receive support. I mean, that's how I felt when I first spoke to Matt. This is what makes his work even more important. And if you want to find out about their work, how you can become involved, how you can connect with Matt and his team, I encourage you to head over to their website, themekongclub.org, to reach out to them and find out how you can make a contribution too. Stay tuned for more conversations on the Sustainable Development Goals and subscribe to #Impact Podcast from wherever you are listening right now so you don't miss our updates. Reach out to us at hello@hashtagimpact.com and find more information on how you can become part of Season 5 as well. We'd love to get your voice heard on our channel too. And you can find all the information over at hashtagimpact.com/Season 5. Thanks so much for joining us today for this Hashtag Impact Classic. And I talk to you very soon. Bye.